God, I thank you that I am not like all those other people. Now, who prays like that, really? No, I'm serious. I know we've certainly thanked God for our particular circumstances over and against those of others, but have you ever known someone to pray words like those, especially aloud? Of course not. We just think them. And from time to time, we might say them to someone else we trust. Can you imagine living in that country? Did you see what she was wearing? He can't possibly believe that's true. I'm glad I'm not like those people. No, I suspect most of us are not praying such words, but they are undoubtedly part of being human. Why else do you think Mark Zuckerberg is a billionaire? After all, social media is our greatest evidence. Just ask Asina O'Neill. By the time Asina, a native of Australia, was 18, she had more than 200,000 followers on YouTube and 500,000 on Instagram. And then suddenly, she quit. She vacated the social media space that had made her a star, explaining in a final Instagram post why. Without realizing it, she writes, I've spent the majority of my teenage life being addicted to social media, social approval, social status, and my physical appearance. Social media, she continues, especially how I use it, isn't real. It's contrived images and edited clips always ranked against each other. It's a system based on social approval, likes, validations in views, and success in followers. It is perfectly orchestrated, self-absorbed judgment. Which at first glance is seemingly what our parable is about from Luke's gospel this morning. The Pharisee in all of his self-absorbed judgment will be humbled, and the tax collector, even though he's a sinner, because of his humility, he will be exalted. It's fairly straightforward in the end. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. The point seems altogether clear. Be more like this humble, contrite tax collector, and less like this self-absorbed, judgmental Pharisee. One of my all-time favorite movies is the well-known film from the 80s called The Goonies, mostly because that was the movie, along with the Indiana Jones franchise, that taught me about booby traps. Now, there's nothing more fun than watching a scene in one of these movies. The hero walks along a path that seems fairly straightforward, even safe. Most of the time, they suspect the threat is no longer present. Then all of a sudden, danger rears its head in front of them, and they turn back to run the other way from which they've come, only to find that path is closed off. Suddenly they're caught. They're trapped. Which I can't help but wonder is really meant for us in this parable. After all, the parable Jesus tells by their very nature are never meant to be straightforward cliches. No, there's always something beneath the surface, always a bite that comes with a bitter aftertaste, aimed to teach us something that perhaps we hadn't thought of before, or at the very least, overlooked. Could this story then be a sort of parable trap? Specifically, I can't help but think the Pharisee is, in fact, a straw man. It's a fairly common thing to do in rhetoric and polemic at which Jesus is masterful. The straw man technique is somewhat difficult to explain, but fairly easy to understand when you experience it. If you were to Google the definition, you'll find the example of U.S. President Richard Nixon's 1952 checkers speech. While campaigning for vice president in 1952, Nixon was accused of having illegally appropriated $18,000 in campaign funds for his personal use. In a televised response, he spoke about another gift, a dog that had been given by a supporter. Nixon said it was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate he'd sent all the way from Texas, black and white, spotted, and our little girl Tricia, 6 years old, she named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, they love that dog, and I'm just going to say right now that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. You see, the dog was the straw man. Nixon's critics had never criticized the dog as a gift or suggested he return it. But this argument was successful at distracting many people from the funds and portraying his critics as nitpicking and heartless. Nixon received an outpouring of public support and remained on the ticket, and of course, he and Eisenhower went on to win by a landslide. Now, obviously, Jesus' ethic and intention here are different. But what if the ploy is the same? What if you and I are supposed to get sucked into judging this Pharisee? I mean, Jesus portrays him so obviously unlikable that I even ask the judgmental question from the outset. Who prays like this? Really? One almost can't read this parable without regarding this Pharisee with contempt, without thinking to oneself, well, at least I'm not like him. And there it is. Do you see what happens? All of a sudden, you and I are the Pharisee in this parable, making the very same judgment he's making, perhaps not in prayer or even aloud, but undoubtedly in our heads. As I once heard someone wise say, prejudice against the prejudiced is still prejudice. A few years ago, after the death of Jerry Falwell, Will Willimon wrote a thoughtful essay about an experience Willimon had had while serving as a senior minister of Duke Chapel. As most of you know, Falwell was the founding minister of Thomas Road Baptist Church and Liberty University in Virginia. Both have been known for teaching extreme Christian conservative thought and even accused at times of being racist and sexist and homophobic. A student dared Willimon to invite Falwell to speak at Duke Chapel, which saw itself in the opposite light, a bastion of progressive Christian thought with very open and inclusive ideals. And so he did, much to the chagrin of faculty and student organizations on campus, which erupted in protest, reminding Willimon of all the things Falwell had said over the years. But in the spirit of Christian unity, Willimon kept his promise and invited Falwell to speak at Duke Chapel. When it came time for Willimon to introduce Falwell for the speech, there were boos and hisses from the hostile audience. The speech was unremarkable, not particularly interesting, but not offensive either. When it's time for questions, Willimon assumed things would get ugly fast, and they did. The first question was very confrontational. "You preach hate," the woman said. "How many African Americans do you have at Liberty University?" The audience responded with cheers and applause. Falwell responded, "Young woman, you could not have asked a question that hurts me more deeply. It's my most regrettable failure. I've worked, I've prayed, I've recruited all over the country. And I regret to say that only 12% of the student body at Liberty is African American. On the other hand," he continued, "here at Duke, your endowment is 50 times larger than ours. You've had many, many more years to work on this. And do you know how many African Americans are enrolled here at Duke? No? I'll tell you. 6%. 6%. I pray the Lord will help you do better." Dead silence fell on the auditorium. The truth is, I'm not sure there's a parable that speaks more to our context than the one we've read this morning. I mean, isn't that what you hear everywhere these days? Bias against the biased, intolerance for the intolerant, judgment against the judgmental. We can all become the Pharisee who's judging the Pharisees. You see, it's easy to say that as people of faith, we're called not to be judgmental, especially in a congregation like this one that values openness and inclusion. We do all that we can to create a safe place to worship God and explore our faith, but it's a slippery slope, isn't it? An offhand comment about all those judgmental evangelicals turns into contempt for a whole tradition. Labeling a group of people as being racist or sexist or homophobic creates the same division we blame them for creating. A little joke about those heartless Republicans or those mindless Democrats turns into disdain for an entire political party. I think James Baldwin says it best when he writes, "No one is more dangerous than the person who imagined themselves pure in heart. For his or her purity, by definition, is unassailable." Which in the end might be our greatest challenge in bridging the divides of our time. When Mary and I were first married, we lived in the Tidewater area of Virginia. As a result, we regularly navigated bridges. But one of the primary ways land was connected in that area was through a series of underwater tunnels. For my daily commute to Portsmouth from Newport News, I had to go through either the Monitor Merrimack or the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. And inevitably, it was a 50-50 chance that I would run into tunnel backup because the tunnels were 2 lanes. All it took was for one car to get stuck in that tunnel, for an entire region to be gridlocked. People could only make progress on the road if the tunnels had both lanes open for traffic coming and going. And I can't help but think that's part of Jesus' point here. The truth is, while this Pharisee's judgment of others is harsh, otherwise, he's the poster child for faithfulness. He obviously comes to temple to pray. The text reads he fasts twice a week, he tithes. He's not perfect, but he does better than most. And while the tax collector is the poster child for sinfulness, remember, tax collectors were understood as being greedy, taking advantage of the poor in that time. Jesus says he's exalted for his humility. While the story goes, the tax collector stands far off, both of these individuals are nevertheless still in the temple together. Both, in the end, are forgiven. And while only one goes down justified in this story, both are important for furthering God's kingdom here on earth. And what if that is ultimately Jesus' point? What if this parable is a reminder that things are not always so black and white, so cut and dry when it comes to faithfulness? That we need some of the bold, honest faithfulness of the Pharisee while simultaneously having some of the unpretentious modesty of the tax collector? That is the point of a bridge, isn't it? The recognition that both sides are needed. In fact, Parker Palmer says this is the most important lesson for our time. That in order for our world to survive and thrive in the future, humanity must learn to have both chutzpah and humility. By chutzpah, I mean knowing that I have a voice that needs to be heard and the right to speak it. And by humility, I mean accepting the fact that my truth is always partial and may not be true at all. And so I need to listen with openness and respect, especially to those whom I might refer to as the other. Some of you likely heard or read about the comments made by John MacArthur earlier this week, a prominent evangelical pastor. At a celebration for his 50th anniversary of his ordination, he decided to weigh in on whether or not the Southern Baptist Convention should allow the ordination of women. Specifically, during his speech, he said that Beth Moore, an evangelist and founder of Living Proof Ministries, should, quote, go home, end quote. I watched my own social media feed explode in outrage and surprise by his comments. Quite frankly, I'm always shocked to hear such sentiment today, despite having a wife who's ordained and knowing all the challenges she's faced for simply being female and a clergy person. But But I suppose it shouldn't be a surprise given the history of the Judeo-Christian tradition. In fact, I remember in my previous congregation teaching a Sunday school class, we were discussing some of the issues of gender in the Bible. And I wrote on the whiteboard a prayer that was prayed by a sect of Judaism early on, for many centuries. It was prayed by men at first light, and it goes something like this. Blessed are you, O God, King of the universe, who has not made me a woman. I asked the men in the room how they felt about this prayer, and all, of course, were appalled that someone would pray it. Then one honest man in the room said, but I'd be lying if I not thought these words at one time or another. I mean, everything women have to deal with in society and our culture, all the junk they have to put up with, even in the church. Not to mention what their bodies go through in childbearing. I'd never pray those words, but I'd be lying if there weren't times I felt relieved. And then one of the women said, you know what though? Even with all of that being true, I wouldn't trade being a woman for anything in the world. Quite frankly, I think it's God's greatest gift to me. And I'm grateful for it every single day. And there it was. This parable on full display. Be careful what you judge another person for. It might turn out to be God's greatest gift.